The topic tonight is what to do when you're in debt, and I've tried to arrange the presentation, which I hope will be short and informal, on around three essentially actions that hopefully will help a person to assess and understand what to do about debt. The first is figure out how bad it is. It's something that people often avoid doing because it's unpleasant, but it's impossible to make a good plan of action without taking that initial step. The second is know the worst that can happen. It's very likely that your fears about what could happen from the debt and from what would happen if you went into default are actually worse than the reality. And even if it isn't worse, it's good to know exactly what you're dealing with and the situation that you're in. And finally, make a plan. There are several techniques that usually can lead most people to being out of debt, either through bankruptcy or through some long-term payment and settlement process. And even if that is not possible in your situation, at least it's important to have a plan and understand the legal protections so you can keep body and soul together and provide for your family, even while having the obligations of the debt that you might be under. So when I say figure out how bad it is, the first step is actually to make a budget, is to understand your income, which most people actually have a very good idea about. So it's an easy first step. A budget does not need to be fancy. If you're comfortable using a spreadsheet or a computer budgeting tool, that's useful. But the fact is, a spiral-bound notebook works just as well. It's just important to have a place where you're keeping all this information in some sort of organization, and something that when you flip through the pages or flip through the screens, that you can really get a sense of where you're at. So when you make a budget, of course, the first step is just figuring out your income, which you probably already know. The second is listing your debts, both the monthly obligation, the minimum monthly payment, which we all tend to know off the top of our heads, though we may not list it in one place. The second is to know actually what you are paying for that debt, the interest rate that you're being charged, any other fees that may be on top of it, like a credit card line, and also the total amount owed. That's extremely important. That's actually the way that our society is dealing with debt currently, or at least the way that we're being sold debt. We're very much encouraged to think in monthly payments and in monthly budgets. But the simple fact is, all debt is paid back, discharged in bankruptcy, or written off after you die. Debt doesn't go anywhere. And the total amount you owe, or that any of us owe, all of us are in this game, is extremely important in knowing your situation and knowing what options are available. The third, and this is a point that I will come back to several times, is beware of scams. There's an emotional overlay about debt in our culture. There's a lot of guilt associated with it, especially if someone is in default, if someone has missed a payment under a contract. We don't view it as a financial setback. We view it as a moral failing. I mean, everyone does. Both the person who missed the payment, the creditor, the judges in a court process. It's just part of our culture. And it clouds thinking, in my opinion. It's good to recognize that it's there, and it's good to recognize it in yourself. But this isn't a moral question. The question is essentially one of practicality, how to understand the situation that one finds oneself in, and how to figure out a plan of action to improve it. But counseling agencies and debt settlement companies and all of the other scams, although there are some of these that are not scams, I shouldn't be so broad-based, but so many are scams, where they charge. I mean, there's a few that are outright scams where the debt settlement company or the credit counseling company will take your money, usually a debt settlement company because they're the ones that charge the higher fees, will take your money with the idea of negotiating settlements with the credit card lines or other unsecured creditors. And some are outright scams where they simply take the money and run. Others, and which is much more common and is what we see relatively often, in my practice, or I see relatively often in my practice, are places that do what they said they were going to do, but they charge a very high price. It's not uncommon for the initial fees that one has to pay before any actual negotiations occur to be several $1,000s. Sometimes only $1,000, sometimes up to $3,000 or $4,000. There also will be monthly fees to cover, essentially to stay as a client of the debt settlement firm. And there could be additional fees if they're able to settle any debts that you have for less than their face value. It is, most of what they're doing is not illegal. Any of us can contract for fees from professionals, just like we do from a plumber. But many of these companies charge much higher fees than the market really allows. Often you could hire, at least in rural parts of the state, you could hire an attorney's office to do all of this work for you, for even at their billable hours, for substantially less money than the debt settlement company is charging. Another aspect that's important to understand, and it's a concept that all of us need to know, is the difference between a secured debt and an unsecured debt. A secured debt is something like a mortgage, or something like most car loans. It's where the entity that gave the money in the first place, or that loaned the money in the first place, has a security interest in some real object. And if the debtor fails to make the payments under the contract, the creditor can then take that object. If you fail to make payments under a mortgage, the bank can take your home. The car company can repossess the car. These types of debts, both in the real world, people need their homes, they need their cars, so these debts become higher priority, and they need to, and staying current on these debts is of the utmost importance. And also in bankruptcy and in some of the other court processes, knowing whether debt is secured or unsecured can affect the outcome in that process. Unsecured debts are things like credit cards, medical bills, most service contracts. It's not true of contractors, but what you may owe another professional, a lawyer, for instance, in most instances, are unsecured debts. And those sorts of debts can be discharged in bankruptcy. And those creditors essentially need to go through the court process. They need to actually initiate a lawsuit and get a judgment against the debtor to force payment. Whereas a secured creditor can often threaten to take the object that's secured to force payment, even though the court process is open to them. Because unsecured creditors actually have less leverage, they tend to be the most aggressive collectors. And it's usually a pretty good rule of thumb, the more aggressive a creditor is, the less real leverage they have. I mean, your bank that holds your mortgage may send you a few letters, may make a few calls, but they're not calling you at 10 o'clock at night. They're not threatening you with anything but what they can actually do, the foreclosure. A defaulted credit card that's sold to a third-party company that collects on those debts, those collectors can often be very aggressive, in part because they have less leverage, and they hope that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, essentially that a person will prioritize that debt over other debts that may actually have more legal leverage because the collector is more strident. Once you have a picture, essentially a picture of your monthly, something else that I should have mentioned is figure out your expenses. It's often a good first step is to write down your monthly recurring expenses, the electric bill, the annual recurring expenses, the property taxes if you pay them outside the mortgage, life insurance, oil, what other expenses that are out there that recur and that you can predict. It's also good to try to put a figure on expenses that you may not track on a monthly basis, like groceries, clothing, car maintenance, gas, tires, those sorts of things. It's going to be hard to estimate all of these, but usually if the adult members of a family sit around a table, they actually can put really good numbers to most of these things in an hour or two, sometimes in much less. I know when I counsel families that are facing foreclosure, this is one of the first steps, is to figure out the household budget and to figure out what things are really costing. And the goal there is for accuracy. I mean, later, when you're trying to look at different expenses, it may, you may be making a decision on whether a certain service is worth it. The obvious is cable TV, the second car, some things that may or may not be necessary in your household. But the first step is just to understand what's going on. And to put in a little bit, because all of us just spend money kind of without noticing it, whether it's, the occasional going out to eat or the occasional coffee or whatever, a pack of cigarettes, whatever it is. And it's good to have just a catch-all at the end that seems to capture that. And if you find that in your written budget, there's a pretty sizable surplus at the end of each month that doesn't actually exist in the real world, go back to the budget and figure out where the money is actually going. I mean, people aren't wasting money. Most of the money is going on necessities, but even so, it's good to understand where it is.